Every once in a while, this is where things get good. Every once in a while, someone will say yes. And your dad will be like, yeah, I went through a very similar thing, started shooting myself up with testosterone, and that's how I learned how to be a man. I swear to God, every once in a while you have that. And then it's an eye-opening moment, right? And it's like, wait a minute. Maybe my dad has gone through something similar, right? Maybe this is why he's terrified, because he's spent his entire life trying to convince himself that he's cisgender. I swear to God, this happens every once in a while. It happens. Hey, everyone. I've been watching Healthy Gamer for a while, and it's helped me out, but this is the first time I've had the courage to write anything. Strong work, right? I recently came out as trans to my family, and they have not taken the news well at all. I feel bad because even though it's something that I have wanted to do because it will make me happy, it ends up hurting a lot of people in the process. My friends and extended family have been very supportive of me, but my immediate family is basically disappointed with me. They try to convince me about how I should try to date girls, work out more, and take testosterone so that it would fix me. I know that deep down it wouldn't change my feelings, but it's hard to communicate that to them, so I end up lying. How could I date someone if I can't even look in the mirror and see myself? All my life, I've had feelings of powerlessness, and I've been trying to meet the impossible standards of my parents. I understand that it is a lot for them to process, and I would be very scared if I was in their shoes, but their lack of compassion and understanding is very disheartening. Anyways, if anyone has advice or thoughts and is going through a similar experience, I would love to hear about it. So this, unfortunately, is an increasingly common experience that is precisely why it's very, very important to talk about. So what we're going to talk about now is, first of all, if you're trans, how can you talk to your family? There's going to be a lot of individual variation there depending on, your family and what the situation is. But in general, I think that one of the things that we've missed out on is sort of a skill set to talk to our parents or other people about things that they're not really comfortable with. So it doesn't have to be trans. It can be stepping away from the religion of your parents. It can be stepping into a different religion. It can be wanting to become a professional gamer or streamer as a career. It can be getting a tattoo. It can be moving out of the house. It can be majoring in something that is not, if you're Indian, medicine, pre-law, engineering, finance, or CS, right? Like there are all kinds of things that our family will react poorly to. And then we sort of feel like, there's a lack of compassion and understanding. It starts to feel very disheartening. And then what we end up doing is we end up lying. And why do we do that? It's to preserve some semblance of a relationship, right? Because you can't fix this problem, so I'm going to just sweep it under the rug. Because you care about your family. Presumably your family cares about you. This doesn't seem like, when you try to talk about it, things don't seem to be moving in the right direction. And so as a result, what's the point of having a conversation that's just going to move things in the wrong direction? So then you start avoiding, you start lying, you start feeling internally disconnected from them. You start putting on a mask, and you kind of wind up in the situation where your family disapproves of your choices, whether it's sexuality, gender identity, religion, career choice, what you wear. I one time had a patient whose parent felt personally offended by their grooming habits. They're like, don't you realize how you make me look bad when you don't shave? Don't you realize how bad it makes me look? Right? It's like, I didn't realize that my personal grooming had to be held to the standard of your social reputation. I didn't connect those two dots. Right? So the question then becomes, okay, how do we talk to people like this, right? So the first thing is, especially if you're trans, I think you've got to be careful for a number of reasons. The first is that remember that gender identity and even sexuality tend to take time to form. So I've worked with some trans people who knew from a very, very young age that their gender identity was not like their biological identity. And they were like, It was set in stone a long time ago. They were just born into the wrong body. I've worked with other people who felt like they were non-binary or something in the middle, and then like later on sort of like solidified actually their biological gender, right? So there's the teenage years and adolescence and young adulthood are like a big part of discovering who we are. And so one of the things that I think actually happens way too often is that we try to jump to labels to capture our experience. So for example, like just because someone, starts to have feelings starts to be sexually attracted to the same gender, let's say at the age of 14 or 15, they may be terrified that they're actually homosexual, jump to the conclusion that they're homosexual. They assign themselves a label because it helps them organize their life some. And then later on, they may discover actually that they're bisexual or pansexual. So this is something that I think is actually kind of a problem, is that I think we jump to labels too quickly. And now we have so many labels, right? So I'm like demiflex, I'm non-binary, pansexual, bisexual. So just remember that discovering who you are is a process. It's not something that you have to like figure out by the age you're 15 and a half, and then you stamp yourself with a label and that's what it is for the rest of your life. That's been my predominant experience. So give yourself time, don't lock yourself in. If you know what you are, if you're one of the people who knows from the very young age, then that's totally fine. Then it doesn't apply to you. I've seen both versions, okay? So then the question kind of becomes, how do I talk to my family? So this is where, as this person kind of pointed out, it's a lot to absorb, right? So this is also where if you think about issues of gender identity and you think about the time scale that the individual has to come to terms with their gender identity is usually a lot greater than what their family has, right? So like if I've been struggling with my gender identity since the age of 3, and then on my 19th birthday, I come out to my parents as transgender, I've had 16 years to like figure that out, right? And then like 6 months later, my parents haven't nearly had that much time. I mean, they've had 6 months and you've had 16 years. So it is a lot for people to process. They have certain conceptions of you, right? They have certain maybe hopes or dreams or things like that. So parents oftentimes have to go through, when I'm trying to help parents develop healthy relationships with their transgender children, we'll actually go through a mourning process. And I've done this also with parents who have special needs kids. So I'm not trying to say that trans and special needs is the same. My point is that both of these kinds of situations are a parent will develop a conception, or even non-special needs kids, just kids who decide not to become doctors with Indian parents. So there's a mourning process that parents need to go through, where they had all these ideas of like, for example, it seems like, you're biologically, you're born as a man and, you're a transgender woman. So your dad or mom may have had all these dreams and kind of like hopes about what she was going to do with her daughter-in-law, and she was going to have these daughter-in-law spa weekends and all this kind of stuff, right? So your parents have like built up all these conceptions, which it takes time to like let go and mourn. So I think it's healthy for parents to like mourn that kind of stuff. And then you as their child should try to be as patient as you can. So that's the first thing, is to recognize that the timeline that you've had to deal with this change and the timeline that your parents have had to deal with this change is probably different, or your immediate family. The next thing to consider is that oftentimes when you are trying to get your parents to understand, that's the experience that I've had with a lot of trans people, is that they're struggling to get their parents, their family to understand, right? Like their lack of compassion and understanding is very disheartening, which I completely get. So this is where it's foreign to them. So it's going to be hard for them to understand. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but oftentimes what I think is almost like a mistake, or if it's not a mistake, it's just you need to think a little bit about whether this is the primary thing you should be doing at this time, is instead of trying to explain to them what your experience is, try to understand their experience. This is the second thing that you can do. So I would start with questions like this. So when I work with families, these are the kinds of questions I'll ask as a therapist in the room, which kind of brings people together, right? Which is that, so now that you've discovered that, this person who you thought of as a son is actually like your daughter, What is that like for you? What does it mean for you that if I'm a woman instead of a man? What is the significance of that? And you can even dig into some of the stuff that's actually really hurtful, right? So this is the hardest thing, is that sometimes family members will try to like slot you into their conception. So once I have a conception of what your life should be like, and this has nothing to, I mean, this goes way beyond, being trans or special needs or whatever. So if I'm a parent and I have a conception, I'm a baseball coach and I want my son to be a star baseball player. You can have trans expectations, you can have sports expectations, you can have career expectations, right? And to be fair, not all of these have the same level of difficulty in terms of adjustment. So I think coming to terms with the fact that your child is of a different gender requires I would hope, a larger shift than someone who doesn't want to be a professional athlete. If that's bad, if that's the scale of change that a professional change is. And so they have this like conception of what they want you to be, and you don't want to be that thing, right? So they grew, like when you were 2 years old, you got your first catcher's mitt, and they threw the ball around with you every single day, and then you were like, actually, I don't like baseball. I like Fortnite. And then what your parents do is they try to slot you back in there, right? So your parents may say things like, pretty unaccepting things like, try to date girls, work out more, take testosterone so it'll fix you. It'll be like, they're like, get back into the box. We've put this box for you. And you need to inject yourself with a hormone and then get back into the box, right? Because if you have to inject yourself with hormones, that's really, that's how you know what's natural and what is suited to you. So this can happen a lot where parents like just don't understand you. And so they try to they're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to make it work in their head. So they'll try to push you into a particular thing. And that's where I would, once again, ask them questions. So I would start with questions like, if I dated girls, what do you think that would change? Right? How would that affect me? How would that affect you? What effect do you think dating girls would have? If I started working out more, what do you think would happen? So just ask them open-ended questions in a non-judgmental way. And oftentimes I find this is the best way to expose their ignorance, right? So when they're unable to provide answers to these questions, and they may provide answers once you work out more, it'll just become clear. And then I would dig in a little bit. Help me understand that. So you seem really confident that what will become clear? And then let's say your dad does work out, doesn't work out. Do you feel like when you work out, do you feel like that's when you feel like a man? Do you feel like a man at other times too? What is your understanding? How do you know you're a man? So I would just start to ask lots of questions, right? So try to understand their viewpoint. And as you ask questions and as you sort of try to understand their viewpoint, that's going to do a couple of really important things. The first is that it'll establish a dialogue of curiosity and understanding instead of trying to convince people or force people or whatever. So you're going to be modeling for them that, hey, I'm here to listen. I'm here to try to understand. And it opens the door for them to reciprocate. Huge. This is why people go to licensed therapists, because therapists establish a foundation of curiosity and openness and understanding. Second thing it'll do is it'll start to help you understand how to talk to them. Because once you understand their understanding of how the world works, that transgender issues can just be fixed with testosterone. Gender identity issues can be fixed. And then so you can be a little bit inquisitive about that. Be did you need to take testosterone to understand that you were a man? And then every once in a while, this is where things get good. Every once in a while, someone will say yes. And your dad will be like, yeah, I went through a very similar thing, started shooting myself up with testosterone, and that's how I learned how to be a man. I swear to God, every once in a while you have that. And then it's an eye-opening moment, right? And it's wait a minute. Maybe my dad has gone through something similar. right? Maybe this is why he's terrified, because he's spent his entire life trying to convince himself that he's cisgender. I swear to God, this happens every once in a while. It happens. But it brings people together, right? And so, like, it worked for your dad. Now he doesn't take the testosterone shots. He feels, like, secure in his masculinity, like, whatever. But you'll be amazed. Like, so I've seen this all the times with, like, especially things like drug abuse, and I've seen this with patients who have to get abortions or thinking about getting abortions and stuff like that. They had no idea, right? Like, I don't want to go into too much detail for patient privacy, so I'll be a little bit chimerical. But there was one kid I was working with who had a parent who was very controlling. And then, like, kid didn't really know much about, like, parent in their late teens, early 20s. So parent grew up in the 60s, okay? It's like back in the kind of good old days of the 60s. And they showed their kid was going through a drug problem, showed their kid a picture of them, like, at Woodstock or something like that. I don't remember the exact festival. And, like, prompted such an awesome conversation where, like, the reason the parent was, like, so restrictive against drugs is because drugs really screwed up their life and they were totally into it and, like, messed things up and all kinds of stuff. So, like, it's facilitated some surprising sharing. So what you want to do is ask questions, right? Ask questions. Try to get them to understand. Like, explain to me, like, what do you think is going to happen if I do this, this, or this? Right? So if you've tried dating girls, for example, you can even ask them, what's your understanding of, like, who I've dated and, like, what that experience was like? Right? And, like, so you can try to understand their perspective. And hopefully what'll happen is usually what happens in my experience. If you sort of approach things non-judgmentally and really try to understand them, what you'll discover is that there's not a whole lot of foundation to their beliefs, or they have some kind of personal investment. And you can even acknowledge that. So, like, for example, if you're a male to female, if you're going through a male to female transition and your mom really wanted to have a daughter-in-law, right? Because she's got 2 sons. And so she was really looking forward to having a daughter-in-law, because she wanted to have daughter-in-laws, spa trips. That's where you can, like, talk to her about that. And it's like, what's it like for you to not have that? Like, what do you think about, like, me and you going on a spa trip? Right? Because, like, yeah, instead of having 2 sons, now you have a son, now you have a daughter. Like, I'd like to do that with you. And those kinds of things are the kinds of moments and discussions and connections, which I think that in discussions of, like, gender identity, like, we just lose sight of. And so try to just really understand their perspective. And then if you're lucky, if you're blessed, if you're lucky, if you set the right kind of foundation and you try to genuinely understand their perspective, even acknowledge their perspective, you can watch the communication workshop, by the way. That's a video on our YouTube channel that is hard to understand, but is really good if you can understand it. Then hopefully they'll start to try to understand you, and then you can start explaining. But generally speaking, it's been my experience that, like, someone has to be in the right frame of mind. They have to have an open mind to be able to really hear your words. And what I find too often in conversations between parents and kids is that the parents will have a conception, kid doesn't agree with that conception, and the parent is not really in a frame of mind to listen to what the kid has to say. So it's like, it's a flight that, never gets off the ground, basically. And then it leads to increasing frustration and resentment. You're not listening, you're not listening, you're not understanding, you're not understanding. And then you push, and then no one feels understood, and then, like, messes up the communication, and then we go to things like lying and avoidance and let's just pretend and, like, all this kind of other Band-Aid sort of solutions that don't actually fix the problem. And there are a couple of questions you can do to facilitate that. Some of those are really simple questions. They're like, do you want to understand what my experience is? And that's when the parent says yes. And that's when you can ask, okay, what's your understanding so far? And then they'll say, well, I think you're just confused. Okay, what have I said? Have I said that I feel confused at all? They're like, well, no, but you're just confused. Okay. So now you can see why I have difficulty with this conversation, because I'm saying something and I understand that you think I'm confused. But do you see how, from my perspective, it doesn't seem like you're really listening at all? all you're doing is sharing your opinion. Does that make sense to you? Right? Because you're not really acknowledging what I'm saying. And you don't have to get into whether you're trans or not trans. You can sort of focus on the communication issue of the words that I'm speaking are not being received. It's like I'm transmitting this signal, but the signal is like not getting received. And so what should we do about that? You can even ask your parents, what should we do about that? Well, you should just take a testosterone shot and that'll fix the problem. It's like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to do that. Right? So this is, it's a problem for me because I'm feeling like communication is really important for us and that it's not really happening. I'm not sure what else I can do. So if you're in this situation where, you're coming out as trans or anything else that breaks away from your parents' conception, to summarize, a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is that you probably have had more time to come to terms with this than they have. And sometimes the amount of time that you've had is like orders of magnitude higher, right? We're talking years versus weeks or months, decade versus 3 months. So try to be as patient as you can. Second thing is remember that they may have to go through some amount of mourning or adjustment, and that talking to them about what that experience is like can be like very helpful. So, and then what we want to do is sort of create this environment, this sort of foundation of like curiosity and understanding. So instead of trying to get them to understand you, what you need to do is understand them. What does this mean for you if I'm trans? What do you think this means for my life? Are you worried about me, not worried about me? Do you think I'm going to be happy? Do you think I'm not going to be happy? Do you think I'm confused? Like, help me understand that. Like, where do you get the idea that I'm confused? Oh, I see. Because I don't understand things the way that you understand them, you're coming to the conclusion that I'm confused. What's your understanding of how long I've been thinking about this and what this journey has been like for me? So you want to start with curiosity. Try to understand their perspective. And hopefully what they'll do, you'll model that behavior and then they'll start to be open-minded towards you. They may have to do some mourning. And then if you're lucky, at some point they'll want to understand your experience and they'll start to ask you questions. And as they ask you questions, they're actually going to be open-minded enough to listen to your answers. The challenge is that for a lot of people who are trying to get their parents to adjust to some change in my life, if I'm trying to get my parents to adjust, I'm impatient, right? I want them to adjust now. The last thing that I'll say is that sometimes your parents are right? Not necessarily saying for gender identity, but like sometimes your parents are right. So I've seen this especially when it comes into like premature relationships, especially things like marriage, where your parents are like, you're like, this is my partner. I've known them for 6 weeks and we're in love and we're going to get married. I need you to accept them unconditionally. Your parents are like, well, they're kind of an asshole. No, support me unconditionally. This is my choice. I choose my choice. Either you need to accept them or we're done. It's like 18 months later, you get divorced and your parents are kind of like, they don't say it. They're like, I told you so. So sometimes you should also remember, hopefully you have this kind of relationship with your parents where they really do love you and they really do care about you. And their hesitation doesn't necessarily mean that, and this is what we're seeing more and more with the internet, right? It's like I'll post about something on the internet and, it'll be full of my cognitive biases and I'll get like all kinds of support from the echo chamber. And then I get really, really upset by my nuclear family when they don't support me the same way as this echo chamber on the internet. Well, there's like more to it than that, right? So hopefully, what I would strongly, strongly recommend is that you facilitate conversation and you be patient and give them time. It's possible that things don't end up going well, that they really don't want to understand or they're not going to try to understand, in which case you have my condolences. But this is the other unfortunate thing is you can't force someone to understand, right? That's something that you can't do. The best you can do is sort of tee things up for the highest probability of that happening. So you got to be careful.